Welcome to Pharmaceutical Commerce's podcast, Rising Sea Levels. The transportation of pharmaceuticals by sea continues to gain momentum in the quest for greater supply chain resilience. This podcast is brought to you by Klinge Corporation. Klinge provides innovative and ultra-reliable temperature control supply chain solutions and GDP Universal Compliance Initiative, creating a joined-up approach to pharmaceutical logistics. To find out more, please go to klingecorp.com. That's KLINGE corp.com. And now, here's your host for this podcast, the Senior Editor for Special Projects for Pharmaceutical Commerce, Megan Manzano.
Hello, everyone. This is Megan Manzano, Senior Editor of Special Projects for Pharmaceutical Commerce, and I'm here with Allan Klinge, CEO of Klinge Corporation, and Allan Kennedy, GDP Universal Compliance Initiative. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us, Megan. We're really excited to be here to talk about this important topic.
Awesome. So we're going to dive right in. What does a typical pharma cold chain look like, and how much is moving by road, air, rail, and ocean?
Okay, well, I'm Allan Kennedy, and that's a very good question. So I'm going to start by saying that, first of all, there may not be such a thing as a typical pharma cold chain, but if there is, it's characterized by its high degree of regulatory oversight, and by its very generally high value of the shipments concerned, and by its fragmented nature. Now, it's this fragmentation that makes for a very high number of consignment touch points or hands-offs by different parties during the transportation process. And this brings me on to the most important feature of the pharma cold chain. This is the fact that the extreme environmental sensitivity of many pharma products means that they are very sensitive to extremes of heat or cold. And the most important thing to bear in mind here is that pharmaceuticals that are temperature compromised during transportation not only waste a huge amount of money, but can also lead to serious health implications if patients receive potentially dangerous medicines or are denied access to necessary treatments. However, having said that, slightly less than half of all pharma products are currently transported in a temperature-managed environment. But the proportion of cold chain amongst it is growing very rapidly on account of the emergence of highly temperature-sensitive biologic drugs, which are generally made, as the name suggests, from living organisms. So the classic case of a biologic drug would be a vaccine, of course, but you've also got products such as gene-based therapies, recombinant proteins, and the like. Now, in terms of how much is currently moving by the different modes of transport, a recent research report indicates that although air freight remains the principal transportation mode for the long-distance movement of pharmaceuticals, with 48% of the total involving at least an air freight leg, sea freight is now being used in 41% of pharma shipments, and rail in 17%. Now, this leaves road. Now, road only accounts for 20% of road-only transportation for pharma. So if a product is going from A to B across the States, for example, it might only use road, and 20% of all shipments only use road. But I want to make clear the fact that road is used in almost 100% of pharma shipments because it's used as a feeder service. So the product is picked up from the factory gate and it's taken to the railhead, or it's taken to the port, the shipping port, or it's taken to the airport. So road accounts for 100% usage in virtually all pharma consignment situations. And I just want to finish this question by saying that the proportion of pharma consignments that are now being sent by a combination of two or more freight modes is rapidly growing. And that's because pharma companies are looking for additional resilience and flexibility in their transportation. And of course, they're looking for cost savings.
Great. Thank you, Allan. I want to dive a bit deeper into the transportation methods that you were talking about, especially from that study. What are the main benefits of air freight over ocean freight and vice versa?
Thank you for that question, Megan. This is Allan Klinge here. I'll take that one. The questions that were brought up by yourself in response to Allan are very important to the pharmaceutical industry as they look to obtain that flexibility that Allan was mentioning. If we look at air transport, the main benefit of air transport that most companies are considering is speed. And speed means that there are certain visibility, certain tracking items that we'll also talk about later, which come into play, but also that companies have typically thought about it as being a risk mitigation strategy by getting a product somewhere faster. But as Allan mentioned as well, a lot of these products are extremely environmentally sensitive to high heat and low heat. And that means that companies are looking for more stable methods of transport. So the speed tends to be subordinate to safety, and risk is increased during these temperature excursions that can occur during air freight. There is also typically with air freight a quite high cost, and there is a low sustainability when we talk about the environmental impact of air freight. So if we look at ocean freight in general, and the amount of temperature excursions where the products are being exposed to temperatures outside of their normal operating parameters, there's only about 1% of those happening in ocean freight, according to a recent study, whereas about 80% of those are happening in air freight applications. The stable temperature of ocean also, where the container is typically packed and not open until final destination, offers a much better temperature profile overall for the products that are being shipped. And again, the products being shipped in this closed container is quite secure from a security standpoint in terms of not being opened until that final destination location. And it's probably also important to note that air freight is responsible for less than 1%, even close to 1/4 of 1% of all global freight, while ocean freight is moving 75% plus of all global freight. And this is an important distinction, especially when we look at the sustainability side of things, because air freight is emitting approximately 50 times more carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, than ocean freight is when you look at the total footprint. So it's quite an important task for companies to reduce their global carbon footprint, and freight, modal transport, modal shifts from air to ocean can really help them achieve that. So there are those benefits, as we have seen many pharma companies take advantage of. There are a few challenges in the ocean freight industry. One is that the shipment is longer. So we'll talk about how some of the companies are mitigating that in terms of being able to have more visibility on their products as they're traveling this longer duration. There was, of course, recently a lot of schedule volatility in the shipping market. We hope that that's mitigating. It seems to be normalizing a little bit with the supply chain issues we saw. There is a need for increased planning and having inventory, basically floating inventory, on these vessels for some time. And then there's the need to come up with a better and more universal GDP strategy, so distribution strategy for ocean freight that can be applied in multiple countries and multiple jurisdictions. As Allan also mentioned, most of these applications, ocean or air, also have multimodal aspects to them, whether that be rail or, in every case, pretty much road. And these combinations can also help to bring a better solution than just one single mode, air or ocean. And we also see that companies are looking at both air and ocean and making evaluations based on product value and product sensitivity. So it is not to say one is always the right answer, but there may be different applications for both. And for higher value or more sensitive cargo, Klinge Corp has been assisting a number of companies by providing refrigerated ocean transport and storage containers with automatic backup systems and power generation in temperature ranges all the way down to -70°C.
Great. Thank you, Allan. I wanted to touch on a point that you had in your answer here about what has been affecting the supply chain. So how have global pharma freight operations been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question as well. And as I kind of touched on a little bit there, as you mentioned, it's been an interesting time in supply chain. If no one before knew what supply chain was, certainly during the pandemic, they learned a lot. And whether that was somebody receiving an Amazon package at the door that didn't come on time, or it was businesses waiting for containers to be cleared from the ports. There have been many, many challenges which have driven up prices, driven up uncertainty, and certainly caused logistics to be brought to the forefront in a way that it had never been brought before. So I would say from a broad perspective, there have been both positive and negative effects from the pandemic. On the positive side, as I mentioned, logistics are now recognized as a vital part of the pharma supply equation and frankly of all supply. There's a realization of just how fragile this logistics ecosystem is. So that means that there has been more investment and there's been more awareness of this as a primary focus of governments and companies across the world, which leads to more cross-industry collaboration and has been a catalyst for change, meaning that there are now initiatives in place to help streamline the logistics process and also to avoid and mitigate risk. There's been a growth in consignment monitoring and traceability that we'll talk about in a different segment as well, where new applications, new equipment, and new methods of visibility to product supply have been implemented. And there is more intermodal transportation. So people have come up with creative ways to achieve the same cold chain that they had before, but utilizing different multimodal and intermodal transportation options. In terms of negatives, there certainly has been some cost impact. I think we are seeing the beginning of that normalization on the ocean side, at least, but there's still cost impact for some of these newer methods of visibility, some of these newer methods of transport and intermodal transport. But hopefully, as they become more prevalent, we'll also see those costs reduce. There have been some capacity constraints for companies offering these services, but again, starting to see that normalize a little bit here in 2022, late 2022 and 2023. And there have been some temporary relaxation of some regulations during the COVID pandemic that then need to be re-implemented, sort of emergency measures, but we also see those starting to normalize. So both positive and negatives. Hopefully in the end, we come out stronger, and certainly that's where we think we're going to end up.
Absolutely. Thank you. My next question for you here is, what are the main obstacles from a quality assurance perspective of moving pharma freight by sea, and how can these be overcome?
Okay, let me come in on this one there, and let me start by saying that the legislation governing the safe and secure shipment of pharmaceuticals, in other words, the quality of distribution, is generally enshrined in what is called good distribution practice, or GDP. Now, GDP, however, is very generic and non-prescriptive in nature. So the law is essentially telling you what you must achieve, but not how you can achieve it. And furthermore, the very same GDP rules apply to all modes of transport: air, ocean, road, and rail. However, in practice, these are all very different transport systems, meaning that the regulations have to be interpreted and adapted to suit the mode concerned. This, in practice, creates huge problems because different parties in different places, both companies and countries, interpret, enact, execute, and enforce the regulations in different ways and to different standards. And this all makes for a very complex and inefficient quality process, especially as products become more sensitive and supply chains become more global and multimodal. Now, it's abundantly clear from research and feedback that supply chain confusion and impediments concerning GDP remain, and there's a pressing need for a completely autonomous yet industry-driven GDP support framework that covers all freight modes, and one that's global in scope, is supported by the regulatory bodies, and is adaptable to the changing industry and regulatory needs. Such a framework is particularly needed for pharma ocean freight, where more clear-cut GDP guidelines for marine applications would undoubtedly drive more business into its hands. So I'm just going to give a quick plug here for something Allan briefly touched on, which is a new universal GDP compliance initiative that's currently taken shape, and which a large number of pharmaceutical supply chain players have come together with the objective of designing and executing a global GDP compliance program that covers all freight modes. The GDP UCI, as it's called, for Universal Compliance Initiative, will be an independent non-profit that works in collaboration with the industry in order to introduce GDP-compliant processes and solutions and to synchronize and standardize wherever possible. Things like GDP training, GDP auditing, and GDP certification, etc. Now, the launch date for this new program will be March the 1st, 2023, so not very far away.
Great, thank you. I think we've been talking about a lot of things that frame our next question really well here, which is, over the past few years, there have been significant developments in the industry regarding real-time shipment visibility. Can you tell me about these?
Yes, thank you, Megan. This is Allan Klinge, and I will be happy to touch on that as I had in the previous response. I think what we're seeing in response to the move, especially to ocean freight and multimodal transport, is that there has been an increase in need for visibility, product visibility, both in terms of location, but also particularly in terms of temperature data along this transport in the cold chain. So the pharmaceutical market has really responded robustly to this, where in many cases there are onboard data loggers, such as a temp tail or another device that can tell you the temperature at the end of the transport. Companies are really seeking to see the temperature data for their products, make sure the products are safe and ready to be distributed to customers at the time of arrival. So they're wanting to see this during the transit. And this involves both what we call smart reefers. So there's reefer containers for ocean transport that can monitor this data and transmit it, but also independent cellular or GSM devices and satellite devices that can be utilized for this application. So in this case, there's a lot of good solutions out there, and the real challenge is to interpret the data and act on it rather than capturing it. So there's many ways to capture it, but what do we do with the data once we have it? And can we build, especially some of these newer solutions are looking to build predictive analytics to say, where may we see a problem based on previous shipments? Where are we going to see a problem based on current conditions? And how can we intercede to make sure that problem is neutralized or mitigated? The main issue we face in this space really is coming up with a more universal approach, and also just dealing with certain technical issues such as battery life and other options. But most of these are being tackled by the individual companies. And if we can get on a more universal application for how the data is reported and acted on, I think we'll be in a very good space here. And pharma companies certainly are doing this already and working to make sure that they have a good oversight and good feeling about the product safety during the transport to make sure that it gets to the patients in a manner in which they can take it and be sure of that temperature profile being maintained.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. My next question here, with everything we've been talking about, that I would like to know is, where do you see the pharma cold chain in 5 years?
Okay, let me take that. Firstly, there's no doubt that the global consumption of drugs is going to continue to expand significantly over the next 5 years. And this will be at a general rate of about 5% compound annually. But this is a growth rate that's going to be dominated by the cold chain segment. And this in itself is expected to expand at well over 8% per annum and represent more than 70% of total logistics spend. Secondly, in terms of transport modes, the disruptions of recent years means that going forwards, pharma companies are going to remain very cautious about putting all their pharma eggs in one modal basket, and shippers will be switching freight modes much more readily. Thirdly, pharma logistics will be continuing to adapt to the new agile manufacturing and stockholding policies that have emerged in a world of greater uncertainty. It goes without saying that the post-pandemic pharma logistics strategies of pharma companies will be more vigorously embracing the need for resilience and agility. Fourthly, and very importantly, the environmental imperative will be an even bigger concern than it is now and will shape many technical, operational, and commercial decisions over the next 5 years. Fifthly, pharma logistics will also benefit from better freight and what-if scenario planning, with modeling, forecasting, and early warning systems having big roles to play. And as Allan has just explained, real-time consignment monitoring with predictive, preemptive, and reactive capabilities will become the norm as communication systems improve and prices drop. Novel and innovative inventory solutions, such as the floating warehouse concept, which Allan also mentioned, will gain momentum too. Finally, a new global GDP compliance program is coming into existence, which promises to ease the ability of companies to meet increasingly stringent regulatory requirements for pharma distribution. So in summary, the future of the pharma cold chain over the next half decade is one of solid growth, increasing modal flexibility, improved regulatory conformance, and exciting technical innovation.
All right, thank you both so much for giving us a wonderful amount of information today. And I'm really glad that you were here and spoke to me about the pharma cold chain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Megan Manzano, Senior Editor of Special Projects for Pharmaceutical Commerce. Thank you to everyone for listening.
You've been listening to Pharmaceutical Commerce's podcast, Rising Sea Levels. The transportation of pharmaceuticals by sea continues to gain momentum in the quest for greater supply chain resilience. This podcast is brought to you by Klinge Corporation. Klinge provides innovative and ultra-reliable temperature control supply chain solutions and GDP Universal Compliance Initiative, creating a joined-up approach for pharmaceutical logistics. To find out more, please go to klingecorp.com. That's Klinge Corp.com.